Mr. President, we just voted in a very important vote here on the Senate floor in a bipartisan vote to confirm Mr. David Bernhardt as the next Secretary of Interior for the United States of America. It was a strong vote, 56-41. And I wanted to begin my remarks this afternoon by rising to express my gratitude and appreciation to Mr. Bernhardt for stepping up to the plate to continue to serve his country, to continue to serve the Department of Interior, now in the role of Secretary, the individual who's going to be running the Department of Interior for the United States. And I want to thank my colleagues, bipartisan vote here in the Senate, which I think is important, for voting for now Secretary Bernhardt. Actually, I like to be the first senator to call him Secretary Bernhardt, and if you and your family are watching, Mr. Secretary, thank you. You know, I also want to mention I've been listening to some of the speeches made by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and to be perfectly blunt, Mr. President, I find them a bit disheartening, what we just witnessed. I'd like to say at the outset, we can and should disagree. Policy disputes, certainly on issues like lands issues, are really important to me in my state, that's for sure. We can disagree about the direction of how we're going to move some of those policy forwards. And, Mr. President, what is disheartening, though, is when you have someone like Mr. Bernhardt who's willing to serve his country again, and I'm going to talk about that, essentially getting his reputation dragged through the mud here on the Senate floor. It's not a good thing. It doesn't encourage people to want to serve. And so, Mr. Secretary, thank you. I know this wasn't an easy confirmation process, but when you look at his background, this is actually one of the most qualified individuals to serve as the Secretary that we've had in many, many years. He was the Solicitor General under President George W. Bush, confirmed by the Senate. He was the Deputy Secretary for the last 2 years, confirmed by this body, and now he's the Secretary. So I would say those are very, very high quality qualifications. So I just want to talk about him for a little bit. Why do I support Mr. Bernhardt? Well, Mr. President, the Secretary of Interior, the Department of Interior, is really, really important to America. It is critically important to my state, the great state of Alaska. We have over 200 million acres of land under Department of Interior control in Alaska. 200 million acres. That's over two times the size of California. In fact, a quarter of all the lands that the Department of Interior manages for the United States of America reside in Alaska. Let me repeat that. 1/4 of all the lands that the Secretary of Interior manages in America are in my state. So, we take this role of Secretary of Interior very, very seriously, which is why I wanted to come to the floor and again thank Secretary Bernhardt. Let him know that even though there was a lot of senators down here really ripping into him, that the vast majority of us, 56 of us at least, think that he's going to do a great job. Why do we think that, Mr. Secretary? Well, certainly with regard to Alaska, sometimes Secretaries of Interior understand our state and that we're different and unique, and federal laws passed by this body say so, and other Secretaries of Interior don't. And they don't understand that in Alaska you have to balance conservation with resource development and economic opportunity. But, Mr. President, Secretary Bernhardt does. He understands this. And this is refreshing. Secretary Zinke did. This is refreshing. It was a refreshing break from the previous administration, the Obama administration, where Secretaries of Interior like Sally Jewell went out of their way to tilt federal power in a way that disadvantaged the state of Alaska, despite federal laws saying you shouldn't do that. Well, we just had a U.S. Supreme Court decision 2 weeks ago saying that that practice of the Department of Interior and their different officials tilting the law against Alaskans has to stop. A huge case that I talked about on the floor last week, Sturgeon versus Frost, that says the laws of the federal government, particularly as it relates to Alaska, the Supreme Court stated several times in a 9-0 opinion, Alaska is unique. Alaska is different. When it comes to the Department of Interior, it's very different. Well, Mr. Secretary Bernhardt knows that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to have voted for him and supporting his confirmation that we just saw here on the Senate floor. But Mr. President, it's not just me who supports him. Let me provide some quotes from letters and support groups, because again, had you listened to some of my colleagues the last couple days, you would have thought that everybody was against them. Actually, most groups who care about conservation were for them. Let me give one really important group, the Alaska Federation of Natives, an extremely important group in my state. The Secretary of Interior has trust responsibilities to Lower 48 Indians and Alaska Natives. This group had this to say about Mr. Bernhardt. Quote, he listens well, he is articulate in his responses, he draws reasonable conclusions. Moreover, he has established a trusting relationship with the Alaska Native community around the issues of resource development and subsistence hunting and fishing. So they've been complimentary and supportive. The American Farm Bureau. This president's nomination of David Bernhardt as Secretary of Interior is great news for American agriculture. He understands the needs of America's farmers and ranchers and is an excellent choice for Interior Secretary. The Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Who are they? Those are the men and women in each state who manage fish and game, like the Department of Interior. Here's what they had to say. The association is appreciative of Mr. Bernhardt's continued support for the great work of state fish and wildlife agencies in conserving our nation's natural resources. The Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, quote, Mr. Bernhardt has demonstrated he is a true advocate for sportsmen and women across the country by working with the community throughout his career in natural resources management, implementing secretarial orders that promotes sportsmen's access to public lands. A very big issue in my state, Mr. President. Even a group like Ducks Unlimited, his integrity in following the law is beyond reproach. Let me say that one again. His integrity in following the law is beyond reproach. David Bernhardt is a champion of conservation and the right person for the job. Mr. President, when I was the Commissioner of Natural Resources in the great state of Alaska, which is actually a job similar to the Secretary of Interior, where we manage an enormous portfolio of land, water, oil, gas, minerals, timber. I had the opportunity to actually hire Mr. Bernhardt when he was in the private sector as an attorney, helping the state of Alaska with big, complicated lands issues. He did a great job. He was a hard worker. He was a man of integrity. So the list goes on and on of the supporters. So again, Mr. Secretary, we just want you to know that given your background, former Solicitor General of the Department of Interior, former Deputy Secretary of the Department of Interior, who has gotten rave reviews from groups all across the country, and now the Secretary of Interior, my view is you are actually one of the most qualified individuals to hold this position. So congratulations. You've certainly earned it. We appreciate your service to this great nation of ours, your service to the Department of Interior, your service to my state, the great state of Alaska, and we certainly look forward to working with you, continuing your public service for our country, for Interior, for Alaska. So I just wanted to come to the floor, commend you on a strong bipartisan support, and we're going to look forward to working with you.